my country, presented my own country for the first time ever, which is kind of bittersweet feeling of, you know, maybe I should have come sooner, and a lot of regrets, shame, and all that. I mean, what would I do without shame? I'm an LA Asian, after all. Anyhow, so today's topic is not an easy one. It's a story without a happy ending so far. It's a story of injustice. It's a story of ignorance. It's a story of willful negligence. Yes. So it will be, for some people, it might be a little bit shocking, because we might think that we know about the extent of complications that Catholicism can extend upon people. And then there's Ireland, and then people gasp because there's something very specific about Ireland. That's why I'm actually very happy that I'm presenting this paper here today in Poland, who also has similar struggles. But then there are some quite specific differences between the stories of two countries, which I will get to later, and hopefully we get to discuss after my presentation. So my presentation will include kind of three main sections. So in the first one, I will kind of try to fill you in on I'm going to provide an overview of certain historical events that happened in Ireland, just focusing on the last 150 years, which is, trust me, it's enough. I mean, if I was to include the previous, we would need like a whole series of seminars if I was to include the long-term perspective on this, or the longer perspective, I suppose. So the first section will kind of cover some of the key legislations that directly impacted women's quality of life, their bodies, their reproductive rights, and their levels of pain. Let's not kid ourselves. The second section, I will move on to my own still preliminary studies, findings from my pilot survey on women in Ireland living with endometriosis, how they cope with the day-to-day task and work life and so on and so forth. And finally, I'm going to try to wrap it all up and kind of encompass it in such a way to ask important questions, theoretical questions about, try to understand why is it that in a Western country with a very high GDP, I suppose, a success story for businessmen when people make a lot of money very quickly. And how is that in the 21st century? A woman is still in a lot of pain and has nowhere to turn to. And that's on the basis of endometriosis, but not only, as you will see, there's a lot that we have in common, I suppose, with Polish and Irish people. So anyhow, so this does not work. Was that you or me?
I don't know.
That's you.
Oh,
Whoopsie. I'm just going to do a lot of jazz hands now. Okay, sure. Okay, okay, so where do you start? Really, that's the kind of the biggest issue here. The history is, I'm covering very kind of the biggest events when it comes to Irish history and Irish legislation, and some of the most staggering and incidents that happened to women in the past 150 years, and mostly around 20th century. So could you, next slide, please? It's going to be one of those. Next slide, please. So can you keep on clicking? Because it'll be more, yeah. So the story starts with Ireland, is that there's two major power blocks. And as you might imagine that in any kind of successful democratic country, church and state are separate. They're supposed to be separate to have a healthy and liberal society. Ireland was not such a country, to such an extent that they were so very operatively, using the word intimately, intertwined with each other, that it became actually very dangerous on the rest of the society in Ireland. So normally the state would kind of stay, well, the church would stay away from the matters of states and courts and police and army. In terms of Ireland, it's the Archbishop, the most infamous one, John Charles McQuaid, used to attend parliamentary meetings. There were no bills passed without his final say-so. They were very powerful when it comes to any reforms of education, censorship, healthcare, adoption rights. Oh God, the list goes on. So they were very. It wasn't a healthy relationship. Let's put it this way. Worked with them, but not for women. Next slide, please. So this is kind of like a timeline that I've put in here. I'm going to try to walk you through some of them in more detail. The other ones I will just leave for you to imagine what could this possibly mean. So many of you, this is probably the most kind of infamous story from outside that people outside Ireland heard, is the Magdalen Asylums, which the last one was closed down only in 1996, which is again already kind of mind-boggling element in here. So I will discuss them in a little bit more details in a minute. The other one was the Contagious Diseases Act, which is important for understanding the life of women in Ireland, because it incarcerated women in the so-called lock hospitals who were strayed from the path of morality in terms of the sexual mores, let's put it this way. And of course there were prostitutes who were kind of considered as being health risk because of the venereal diseases. So even though it was the men who were spreading those diseases, it was the women who got incarcerated for up to even 9 months in those kind of hospitals, institutions. Then if we move on, the next big event is the Irish Constitution itself. So when it comes to the Republic of Ireland, or the Free State of Ireland, we can go back to 1922, but the actual official constitution wasn't written until 1937, and that is something that is still a very problematic aspect for Polish women, for Irish women, and in Ireland, because there are still some, I think, archaic is the way to go with describing a certain definitions of what's the place of a woman in Irish society. And it has its own consequences. And again, I will walk you through those in just a few minutes. The marriage bar is one of those wonderful legislations that forbade women to stay in employment and civil service after they got married. So that was abolished in 1973, and it wasn't just a civil service, because any woman who actually, it was expected of them that obviously if you get married, your main job that you were born to this earth is to have children and look after them and tend to your husband and the hearth of the home. Okay, so then we move on to another big event, which was the Constitution 8th Amendment of 1983, that was followed by the referendum, in which placed the value of the unborn child on the same scale as the life of a woman. So basically, there was no legally a woman could not terminate her pregnancy if there was a viable fetus in there, or if there was a still cardiac function of a fetus, I suppose. And that was the big moment for Irish people in 2018, when this amendment was finally repealed. And why that happened, I will get to that in a minute as well. But of course, we mustn't forget about the importance of contraception, which was banned for most of the time in Ireland, apart from this slight change in 1979, when a woman was allowed to get some form of contraception from her doctor, but only upon the consent of her husband. You can already see that Polish history kind of goes a little bit differently in here. So maybe there may have been a woman in some kiosk piercing the condoms that she was selling, but yet we can still get some condoms in Poland. Well, not me, clearly not my parents. But anyway, so next slide, please. So as you can see here, so the first one is the most controversial law that I was amendment to the Constitution that I was just telling you about. So this is: the state acknowledges the right of life to the unborn, with a due regard to equal right of life of the mother. So that was repealed in 2018. So the language itself is kind of, vindicate the right. It's already scary. It's just kind of fear-mongering in itself. But the other two are the ones that still exist in the Irish Constitution. And this is something that is supposed to become a part of the next referendum on the next election in Ireland. That Irish people will vote whether is it time to possibly remove that woman's place is within the home in Ireland from the most important document in the country, including of that woman is called a woman, and then of course it follows up that she's called a mother immediately. That's the only identity women have in the Irish Constitution. So this is the kind of very powerful symbolic and legal oppression that already Irish women have been facing for quite some time now, and clearly still exists today. So next slide, please. So if we were to think, I think the buttons got stuck.
Yeah.
Maybe you put it over to me.
Ready?
Okay. So if we were to talk about Irish habitus, we need to, it's a story of fear, it's a story of repressed sexuality and repressed anything bodily and sexual, because, surprise, surprise, Catholic Church rules with fear naturally, and forbids having sexual intercourse, if you call it not sex, nowhere near outside the marriage, the marital bed, or for nothing else apart from procreation. So basically, sex with no element of any sensuality or pleasure, and for having babies only, and you can't enjoy yourself too much. And it is a duty also for a woman to provide her body to her husband whenever he wants it. So the quotes that I'm using on these slides are coming from a specific study by Bette Hilliard from 2003. She came across that. She was actually doing studying something else, but let's not get into that. But she came across that that there's a lot of information that about this kind of disillusionment of Irish women post a lot of scandals of Catholic Church, and they actually spoke very intensely about how disappointed and cheated they felt about whatever they had to go through in their younger years, whereas when they're already retired women and grandmothers probably. So they were just disgusted about how much has been going on, how much has been brushed under the carpet by the Catholic Church and archbishops in Ireland, and the Pope himself, our JP II, wasn't exactly not guilty. Anyway, so of course it's very easy for us to jump to conclusions like, okay, any Catholic country would have the same kind of idea about, yes, of course, sex shouldn't be happening outside of marriage, but they're a lot more lenient about us. In Ireland at the time, there was no room for leniency, and this is one of those elements that I actually mentioned at the beginning of this presentation when I said that when you think you understand the severity, it goes a lot deeper than that. So can you go to the next slide, please? So one of the anthropologists going back to 1960s, because actually Ireland was such a bizarre country at some point that there were anthropologists from the United States coming over and doing various studies of rural communities in Ireland. One of them, John Messenger, in his famous book, he described Irish people as most sexually naive nation in the world. Because as another sociologist much later on, actually from my department in Ireland, Tom Inglis, when he wrote, he was one of the first sociologists who actually wrote about sexuality of Irish people in the late 90s. And he said that how can you be responsible, sexually responsible, if you have zero sexual literacy? The sex education is non-existent. I know that there was no sex education when I was in school. I don't know about, is there one now? I doubt it, of course. Sorry, I just forgot about the government, we just removed. So he also said that if you have this kind of level of blatant ignorance about understanding basic facts of life, as in what happens when two people come together, or where do babies come from, or even to the extent of understanding when a woman gets pregnant, where does the baby actually come from, literally, physically. So there are in the same study by Hilliard, which is that quote comes from as well, is that, it doesn't need much more explanation when the woman says that we didn't know how it was going to come out, and we were like fools. We hadn't a clue. It was neither her or her husband. They haven't even had an idea how they actually got pregnant. Was it the fact that they kissed, or that they slept in the same bed, or was it that they used the same toilet? It was all these kind of bizarre stories, which are really, they're not even funny, to be honest, because it's hard to believe that that was the level of ignorance that was over time impressed upon Irish society. And that was, how did that become? I mean, it's part of the process the Catholic Church did. It was not only that sex was not talked about anywhere, and they were the only authority that were kind of giving any sort of information, including, and of course, there are the medical doctors from Ireland at the time. They are not the ones without the guilt, because many of them were Catholics themselves. And if a woman tried to find help because she couldn't possibly have any children because she already struggles to feed the ones she has, all the 11 of them at home, and they have no, because the husband is an alcoholic, which happened, come on, it's Ireland. Sorry for my Irish guests in the audience, but you know what I'm talking about. And how are they supposed to, you know, they need to be a way to stop that, and the doctor would very harshly kind of put a woman in her place and say that, you know, this is a lot for you and your husband, and it's a sin. Some of them would actually use that argument, not a medical argument about I don't know, legal or even legal argument, because it was technically forbidden in Ireland at the time, but it was the matter of sin, that it is your duty as a woman to give birth to children. So we can already see that, you know, the key actors in the suppression of Irish women, we have the Catholic Church, we have the Irish state, and of course we have the medical practitioners via medicine and healthcare at the time. So women did not know where the baby's coming from during the labor. Even some of them, to the extent that it wasn't even their first labor, it wasn't their first child they were giving birth to. So when they ended up in the hospital, they were afraid to ask any questions. Everybody was very kind of harsh with them. And if they asked questions, they were told off for being asking stupid questions and so on and so forth. So they were kind of terrified into submission, I suppose. So there was this case that one of the women in Hillier study, she discussed the notion of naval births, because some women going into labor, they were thinking that their belly button would actually expand and the baby would come out of this way. They just couldn't put the two and two together, which I don't think that needs much of a comment for that. Also, in terms of keeping people ignorant within Ireland, I suppose is the way of putting it by the Catholic churches, was that there was this physical separation of men and women. So it was very much gender-based separation, so that, I don't know, they do not ask many questions, I suppose, but there was even the issue of not having the language. How do you ask questions about something if you do not know the names of the body parts or the act itself, and which was already shameful and embarrassing. So whatever's going on in your head, the only person that you could ask is probably a priest in the confession, and you know, we might imagine how that went. So there was separation of boys and girls in school, which is still the case in Ireland. Actually, most of the throughout the education up until universities, when they all come together, come to my classes, and they go, no. And so private schools, yeah, sure, they would have kind of unisex classes, but most of the, and still actually the best schools, secondary, first and primary schools in Ireland, they would have some holy name in their name. And they're segregated by gender. So they were segregated in schools, they were segregated in public spheres, in church, they were segregated, unless they were married, of course. Public dance halls, you know, where people might find, so it was girls dancing with girls most of the time, or pubs, which is in itself, the Irish pub it's a fascinating phenomenon in itself, because we can do studies in that too. There was a bar section of a pub, which was for men. They were generally standing and drinking pints. And then there was the lounge section where you could sit down, and where women were not allowed to order drink. They couldn't order a pint of Guinness. They were only allowed to order a glass of Guinness, which is a half pint of Guinness, and drink sherries or baby shacks and some other strange alcoholic sweet concoctions, as you can imagine. Anyway, I do go on, I could talk about that a lot, so can we go to the next slide, please? The infamous Magdalene laundries. Marta, could you please just, yeah. So as some of you may know, whoops, let's go back. You ruined my moment. So some of you may know that this institution existed, but nobody outside Ireland actually realized, actually some of the Irish people today, the younger generations, they do not realize the intensity and the seriousness of these institutions, how much of a kind of prison-like element there were organizing them. So which women ended up in Magdalene laundries? generally young women who ended up either pregnant out of wedlock, so they either ended up in Magdalene laundries or so-called mother and baby homes where they could gestate their babies until they gave birth, and then they were probably moved to those Magdalene laundries depending on their age as well. So they fell pregnant, like I already said, without knowing how that happened. The guy probably knew little as well, and this happened. Some of them were victims of abuse. Some of them came from orphanages themselves, just because they were pretty. So they already were in an orphanage and they were coming of age, and so the nuns, because who else would have sent them to Magdalene laundries, because as one of the women in some other documentary I saw said, because you're pretty as a picture, so you're already dangerous, danger to yourself and the men and the community. What happened was that if a woman fell pregnant, she was sent to those institutions by the families, because they were ostracized by their own families because of the shame that it brought upon them, the whole clan, I suppose. And they would rarely go back there because the community, because mostly rural communities, they already ostracized them, and they're already the wanton women, the dangerous women with the adult letter, scarlet letter upon their chest, invisible letter. What is more horrible, what came out apart from the hard physical labor and 7 days a week, and was that children were separated upon giving birth from their mothers, and they were put up onto what was, and we need to call it that, they were illegal adoptions. Children were very often sent to people in the United States, and of course the church was getting a hefty amount of money for that and making a lot of money for that. And a lot of the children that never made it, they were buried in some graves without names, and only recently one of the historians actually University College Dublin, she discovered one of those mass graves of newborn babies that had no names and they were just put in a grave. And basically upon giving birth, the mother may have breastfed the child up to a certain point, that they were removed to the kind of the baby homes, and then they were practically sold off for adoption and some other people, and they never saw the children again. And it was a forced separation, because most of those women didn't want to give up their children, and they wanted to have them and make their own way in life, but the option wasn't given to them. So they would spend many years in these laundries and try to figure out the rest of their life, what's going to happen. They're often heartbroken, and as you can imagine what happened. But anyway, let's move to the next slide, because this is one of the most chilling and blatantly kind of exercising, the physical violence upon women. So I know this is not a term that is it's known much around people, for people. What happened was that during labor, if a woman had a pregnancy, her birth canal wasn't wide enough, and she couldn't, after several hours, many hours of trying to push the baby out, it was just not going to happen. What you would think that a doctor would perform a C-section. What happened in Ireland, that the medical doctors opted out of the C-section, because if they were to avail of that, it would only mean that the next pregnancy or the next labor would have to be a through C-section as well. So the estimate is that you can only do it up to 3 times. So they didn't want women to have that. They want women to give more births, have as many children as possible. So what they did was, with the very little anesthesia, they would sew through the pubic arch, the pubic bone of a woman's body, and widen it, physically widen that, so that the woman could push the child. It is horrific. I'm actually getting goosebumps, even though I've known about it for years. But there is documented that it was 1,500 cases of women that actually came forward that were known in Ireland, and that issue was forced by the UN Court of Human Rights as well. And I think only 200 of the cases were they were met with some sort of legal arrangement. The women they were in pain for the rest of their lives. There was no way that it's symphysiotomy, because that pubic arch, that bone, it's called symphysium. So if that bone breaks, it never heals properly. And because it's the core of our body, every movement is comes with an excruciating pain, even after it's healed. So the women will have problems walking for the rest of their lives, and every movement would cause them pain and some different complications. So it is one of the other very cruel versions of what could happen to a woman if she doesn't have autonomy over her own body, I suppose. And of course, those operations were done without her consent. Nobody asked them. It's like, Mrs. Kavanagh, can I sew through your bone now? No, it was just the doctor was the god, literally in the room. Okay, next slide, please. This is a mural with Savita Halappanavar. She became the face of the latest referendum on abortion rights in Ireland. It was a very sad case of a woman who wanted to be pregnant, wanted to have children with her husband. She was a dentist herself. She lived in the west of Ireland. She was 31 years old. Around the week of 17, she already knew that there was some sort of fetal abnormality happening after one of the ultrasounds. The doctors told her to wait and see what's going to happen. But during the time she started developing symptoms, severe pain in the lower back. She went to the hospital. The doctors examined her and said, we think you might be going through a miscarriage, but let's wait and see, because the fetus was already exhibiting some kind of cardiac activity. So they were waiting. So there was kind of a lot of waiting and seeing what's going to happen, rather than, okay, it's not a fetus that's that is healthy anyway, so we might just reduce that woman's mental physical pain. No, she was left there waiting, and because for days, because the doctors said that up until the time, according to the 8th Amendment from 1983, if there is still viable because there is a cardiac activity, they are not going to intervene with that pregnancy, because that's the law. They could have really, if they had real conscience, or they could have just stepped up and did it. So on day 2, the woman started experiencing a very high fever. They started giving her paracetamol. She developed sepsis, and she died within 4 or 5 days. That case, why am I saying this is the face of that referendum? This is one of those watershed moments when people realize, oh, so abortion rights and reproductive rights are not just about those crazy feminists who burn their bras on the streets and they just are floozies and they just want to have sex with everyone and kill all the men. No, it's not about that. It has a face of a woman who wanted to be a mother and wanted to have children and was young, and that got the latest campaign, the pro-choice campaign, going in Ireland, in the sense that they were showing the real consequences of these the strictness of these laws in the Constitution when it comes to restriction of termination of pregnancies. That image was all over Dublin, all over Ireland, everywhere. The whole the rhetoric of the campaigns of the pro and against campaigns changed for the first time in Ireland. We had several referendums on abortion across the years, unsuccessful, obviously, up until 2018. But what happened was that for the first time, religion was never mentioned. Even by the anti-abortion movements, the religion was never mentioned, because they already saw they lost their momentum. Because they sort of starting to talk about, the narrative was about the personhood of the fetus, the personhood of the baby, which drives a lot of doctors, non-religious doctors, crazy, is that the language that is used, that is the baby and the woman is a mother, and it's just so reductive and just so black and white in many ways, and so manipulative. So the pro-choice campaigners, they were talking about the dangers of what happens if those basic rights are removed for women. So because they die, basically. If something goes wrong with the fetus and the medical doctors refuse to intervene, the woman is dying slowly and painfully and a horrible death. Next slide, please. So that was the interest of this campaign. I know I chose these slides because I just like them. And I love the creativity of the referendums both in Poland and in here. women fighting for their rights. And so keep your rosaries of my ovaries is one of those slogans that we've heard throughout most of the referendums, but then are also the Fallopians with the reproductive rights. So we can see that the image has shifted, and that allowed for that those women who are kind of in between making the decision in referendum that they voted. So Ireland was the only country where it was by the referendum that we passed, that we repealed that Eighth Amendment. Over 66% voted against that amendment. So that was quite an achievement for a country that is so Catholic and so rigorous when it comes to women's rights. But as I say, the narrative had to change for that to succeed. Next slide, please. So in the next one, I want to present some of the findings from my recent pilot survey into women in Ireland living with endometriosis. Let's start with the definition of it, okay? So this is all coming from a World Health Organization website. I was actually a little bit surprised that it even appeared so clearly. Endometriosis is having its moment alongside with menopause out there somewhere. But for some of you who was not aware of endometriosis it's about, well, the cells of endometrium should be the lining of the womb that should be always kept inside of the womb and not going out, somehow makes its way out of that particular system, and the cells attach themselves to different organs in the abdominal cavity of a woman, whether it's the pelvic wall, whether it's outside the ovaries, the tubes. It can go even as extreme as into your heart sometimes. And what is very few people talk about is that those cells behave like cancer. They're not cancer. They will not kill women. They just make them utterly miserable and want to kill themselves because the pain is excruciating. And WHO says that the causes of endometriosis is unknown still. There's no way of preventing endometriosis, and then there's no cure. I know that there's been some revelations in Poland that two female academics finally came up with a sort of a test that you can, I think it's a blood test that you can test for presence of endometriosis in your body and endometric cells. So I'm not going to go into any more graphic details of what a life of a woman is with endometriosis. I was diagnosed after fighting for myself for 16 years. And I was one of the few lucky women who got surgery in 2020, the first summer of the pandemic, which was lovely, in Wrocław. And actually, next slide, please. So let's go back to my survey itself. So I was a bit flabbergasted, very pleasantly surprised that so many women applied to my survey because it was open, I think, for 3 days. And it was part of this kind of group project for my undergrad students who were kind of attached themselves to me because they needed something for their own module. Never mind that, it's boring. Anyway, so there was 21 questions out there. The last question, 21st question, was one open question. So I was asking different questions about the quality of life. How long did they wait until they got diagnosed? That ranged from 2 years to 36 years. I'm sure that the women's age range is here between 19 and 63, but I'm also sure that there's a lot of underage girls already suffering, but they were not part of that survey because they were under 18 years old, so I cannot access them immediately, but I know because I was one of those girls. So and I'm sure there are women who will die with endometriosis because they never maybe even thought about questioning that, or they questioned that, they sought help and they were turned down by many consultants and doctors that were supposed to be helping them. Anyway, next slide, please. So one of the main things that I pulled from this study is that over 93% of women that participated in my survey said that the pain affects their quality of life and work or school, quite severely. And next slide, please. So in here, oh my God, I need binoculars for that one. So in here, it's kind of one of those questions, wider questions. I said binoculars, glasses. That we can see how much it impacts their day-to-day life. So it's a vast majority of women struggle to participate in any social events. They struggle with daily tasks. Anything physical has become extremely painful, and it's just impossible to move because the pain is numbing and debilitating. very few could exercise or look after their health in certain ways. They had problems with intimate relationships because intersexual intercourse is painful with endometriosis very often. If it's not during, it's after, and then you start thinking, it's not worth it. Anyway, so they had problems with relationships because their partners, even family, after a point, they start questioning the woman herself, instead of the fact that there is no help in the healthcare for them to actually get diagnosed. So it becomes this kind of a closed circle of, it's like, well, maybe she's overreacting. I mean, she's seeing 17 specialists. Surely if there was something going on, somebody would have found something. No, that wasn't the case. So of course they would get very depressed. They feel very isolated. I felt isolated from my closest friends because I felt like it was almost, how many times can you say the same thing? So because they would start questioning, whether it's like, oh, you don't want to go out, what do you mean? Oh, not a period, but you just had your period last week. So then you have to go into the details of, my period does not stop after 5 days, it goes on for 10 days. And then comes the ovulation, which is just as horrible as the period. So on a good, actually, if you're lucky, I was lucky that I had 3 good days in my cycle. I am oversharing because I find it is more powerful when I actually do that. People put a face to a problem, to an issue. So you feel defeated, you feel helpless, you feel frustrated. I get angry, embrace your anger, women, because then we are being hurt. And they feel like they lose control over their lives. So this is the kind of the study. This is the kind of the most important parts of that. So next slide, please. So in here, these are the statements of some of the women from that open question. And you can see what it says here, that one strong message is that they are not believed by the medical professionals. They are accused of making things up, that it is all in your head. Maybe I should just slip you some antidepressants because you're clearly struggling. Of course I'm depressed. Nobody listening to me, and I'm dying of pain. Doctors do not emphasize, they don't understand, they don't want to understand. You could say what you want. So on average, it takes about 10 years to get diagnosed, but that's the average. So like I said, it could take between 2 years now to 26, 36, whatever, or never. So when you think back on that definition on WHO website, on how they chose to address the issue with endometriosis, they talk about the medical aspects of it, that, oh, there's no cure, there's no way of knowing where it's coming from. But they're forgetting about one of the major issues here, is that if you're invisible, if that problem is invisible, nobody will even try to find the cure, try the basis or foundations of the illness. Where is it coming from? Why is this happening at all? And we're having the moment, let's hope the moment lasts, and actually there is more research being done now. So women are not being treated, or the treatment fails. It's not enough of it. You get addicted to different painkillers, of course, and which can be devastating on your stomach lining and all these kind of issues. Me personally, I was knowing that Stephen Medal, who was my thesis supervisor, is in the audience. I can't remember my PhD viva. I was high in codeine because I was on my period, and of course, there's no room for questioning moving your viva because I had my period. Who will treat you seriously after that? So Stephen was there, so he remembers plumbing, I suppose. I remember fragments of it, and I don't know, I passed, so hey, something worked. But this is the kind of the day-to-day reality of women had to go through. I was lucky enough because I could afford private healthcare. I could come to Poland, find a clinic who's making money of women's misery, but we're gonna talk about that some other time, in Wrocław, and got operated on. It's better. It's a great no. That's another problem. That's for another study. Is that what happens to women who get treatment, and the treatment is still wrong, and it still makes women miserable for other reasons. But anyway, let's move on from that. So next slide, please. So of course, sociologists, female sociologists, for a while now started looking about the problem of pain in general, not endometriosis, endometriosis and the pain. Again, stealing my thunder here. No joke. So pain is gendered, pain is very political. And some of the sociologists mentioned here in their research, they show that women forever, since forever, they've been kind of, they're told that them being in pain is something normal. It's their natural state of being. When a man feels pain, it's something abnormal, and they immediately get listened to by a doctor. They get the prescription for the right painkiller, and everything's hunky-dory again. If they get frustrated, women, not men, if they get frustrated and make a lot of complaints to different medical specialists, there is the card of the you are emotionally imbalanced. What is going on with you? What do you mean you're in pain and you're yelling at me? Because I am your 11th consultant that you've seen. So there's a lot of problems. But so then the notion of the credible patient is something very big for women in general when it comes to healthcare. But in the case of endometriosis is particularly kind of visible, I think, because from some of the studies I'm talking to my students who experience similar kind of issues to me, or just women in general. So I kind of can't wait to get to the follow-up studies when I actually get to talk to those women in the interviews or focus groups, and talk about their experiences beyond just whatever the few lines in the survey. And they will tell me that what is their strategy for trying to advocate for themselves and be heard. So as many of us in here, I'm sure, know that if you want to be heard to a doctor, you do some survey before. So you do some research online before. You know what to ask for, you do a list of things, list of symptoms and everything. But also, women who suffer from endometriosis, when they go in to see a specialist, one thing you do, you don't want to look too good. You don't want to put too much makeup on. You do not want to look fit and like that you have your life together, because then they will say, like, there's no way you're in that much pain, clearly, because you look okay to me. You seem to manage somehow in life. You didn't come to me in your bathrobe and pajamas because you are out of pain and greasy hair. So you have to manage that. If you go the other extreme, the same thing will happen. You will get a prescription for antidepressants and anti-anxiety medication because it's clearly something wrong with you. You are unkept, very unkept, and you don't even wash your hair. So there is this balance that they strategize to figure out how to manage that to be heard. And then you see your 15 specialist who's sitting there across from you with a smirk, thinking it's just a little bit pain moment. If you get pregnant, it will go away. No, it doesn't. I wasn't trying, but it's just that, comment from a medical professional saying that, well, once you have children, as if every woman wants to have children immediately, it might go away. It doesn't go away. Same with hysterectomies. They do not work for endometriosis. Has been proven, and yet it's still practiced. My surgeon was trying to cut out my uterus, even though he didn't even know if there is actually endometriosis on it. But he was kind of trying to force me to do that. It's like, but do you want children? I says, I don't think so. That was 3 years ago, and still don't want. But the thing is that he was trying to argue. He was like, so woman, he actually said that to me. He was like, woman, you don't need it. If you don't have children, you don't need the uterus. It's like, excuse me, it's mine. I'd like to keep it. It's one of the bigger organs in my body, and I'm pretty sure if that goes, that boy will not just, be okay for my body and for my well-being. Post-surgery, the two surgeons came back to my room, and they said, yeah, your uterus is a bit ugly. We followed it up. I said, excuse me, it's lovely. It's been serving me for many years. And so, anyway, oversharing again. That's why. Anyway, next slide, please. Question we have to ask ourselves: where is the origins, the foundations of all of that? How are we doing the time? Am I going way over? No, very, very, very. Where did it all start? So I'm sure some of you have heard about Thomas Lecaire and his book on the one-sex model of the history of sexuality and sex, where he proven that going all the way back to Galen, that lovely fella, who's famous for his humorism, his theory of humorism and in terms of the human body and how man's body, how it works. So the one-sex model basically told us that, which was left unquestioned for centuries, he says here 17th century, but there's actually evidence that it went on as late as 19th century, where a lot of doctors were thinking that women are just inferior versions of men. That something went wrong and they became women because clearly their penis and testicles are inverted. So basically that women's vagina and cervix is just an inside out, inhaled version of a male reproductive organs. You might find it shocking, but it was left in question, even though they were dissecting women and looking at their bodies. So you're like, yeah, see, I told you, it's a penis. Look, it's a penis inside a woman. Next slide, please, because I need to really speed it up now. Jordanova is one of the women, not the only one, because there also those Simone de Beauvoir, and followed by Sherry Ortner, who's a feminist anthropologist, they were discussing that issue that goes back in history through centuries, and we don't know where does it come from. I know it's a very crude image. I show it to my students because that's the one that she really hits the imagination of. Why is it that we call, it's the mother nature, why is nature female? And it's no longer a compliment, actually, because the whole process of animalization of women's bodies and the fact that they are less, not only just inferior to men, they are closer to animals than to actually human being, is something that is, I think, the legacy of it is dragging on to the medicine today. They don't say that. They're not even probably aware of where this is coming from, but they just treat women, or not treat women, I suppose, as the equal citizens that, they need healthcare, proper healthcare, and just as much understanding as male body, and that their body should be studied differently because there are different when it comes to hormones and the medication, or even the pain trials of the pain drugs. That are 80% of those drug trials are done on male mice or men, even though most of them are used by women later on, because we're just too complicated. It's just too complicated and messy with the hormones and there's cycles, so we do not want that. Anyway, next slide, please, because I'm very behind. Actually, can you skip for another 2 slides because I need to wrap it up and there's just no room for that. I'm very sorry. I do get carried away when I talk about these things, in case you haven't noticed. So let's bring theory into it to make the connection between the Irish women's history of their bodies and their lives and what's happening in terms of endometriosis of Irish women now. And of course, women in other countries can relate, but I thought there needs to be a connection of why. Where is it coming from? So we're looking at it from this kind of more long-term perspective already. So I think that the best way, sure, I mean, this is the figurational center, so I chose to use Elias here, but it's nowhere near, enough. I need to, expand that theory. So this is the kind of questions that I want to ask with this study: is it time to finally, civilize, women's pain from that, and there's a connection to Elias in terms of the structural violence that's been happening to women in different countries, not just Ireland, and followed by institutional violence, which we see with Magdalene laundries, mother and baby homes, doctors practicing their symphysiotomies and other horrible things being done to women. And I know that Elias didn't get a chance to write about institutional violence because we have to move to Foucault, who would be more kind of appropriate to use it here, of course. But there's something about it. We could work with that theory that he has on violence and the civilizing process to kind of expand it and use it in the context of women. And there's nobody, and I'm kind of surprised that there's nobody actually talks about gender and the kind of more and gender pain or the actual impact of gender and women's health through the Eliasian and figurational perspective, because it is endometriosis and women living in endometriosis. It just happens to be that they're part of this very androcentric figuration of the medical healthcare system, of the medical practitioners, and going back to actual study of the diseases and all of that. Of course, we could stretch it out to go towards, because it's a very much gendered issue, we can go back to the established outsiders. But I would beef it up with the whole process of othering, of the concept of the other, which is coming from feminists, and actually looking at how much reducing or discrediting a group of people, minority, funny that women are minority, even though there's more of us, as you know, and how does that happen in terms of the endometriosis? So we could see that women are not believed, they're being discredited, they're exaggerating, and all of that. And of course, we mustn't forget the whole concept of nature, which links very nicely towards whatever we were already discussing about, you know, the Artemis and you know, the fact that a woman is an inferior version of a man, and she's just, because of her reproductive functions and their bodies, that they are closer to animals than they are to men, who's in charge of the culture and the rational thinking men. So I'm going to leave you with this, and thank you very much.